This is the part of the course that gets really interesting because we're going to start doing some really cool stuff. In this lesson, I want to look at the XML HTTP request object in JavaScript. So this was our original object that could initialize and make a connection, essentially make an HTTP request, all done via coding, so basically without page refresh. And this is what we talk about when we say AJAX, because it can run in the background in the code and do these requests and pull back data, and then that data that we can use to update our page content. And that's the whole AJAX process. AJAX isn't a library. It's essentially a bunch of technologies working together to achieve just that, getting data and updating the page with data that's actually not written within the code. And the way that we do that, same way that we go to web pages in the browser, we go using the HTTP format, so HTTP protocol, and we can get information back. So this is the same idea, same concept, but it's all done through coding. And in order to start, first of all, we need to create that first object. So there's our request object. So let's take a look at what this is. So if we go request, we see we've got a bunch of parameters here in this object. So we've got on load, loaded, on progress, ready state. So that's an important one to look at, as well as response and response text, response type. So all of these are going to be really super important coming up in the next set of lessons. So now that we know that we've created this object, we're ready to start using it. And we need to combine it with some other functions, because on its own, it's not really doing anything. It just stays as is. But if we add in some additional values, and you can call this request, you can call it XHR, you can call it whatever you like, whatever makes sense to you. I'm going to call it AJAX because this is AJAX part of the course, and I want to really focus on AJAX. So we've got this AJAX send. So we're executing it, but the state isn't opened yet. So we need to also add in open into the state. And there's some parameters here within open. So we've got the way that we're sending the request. So we're going to do it as a get. And if you're familiar with get, post, so those are some of the options here that you can use, opening up a web page. And we're going to use get by default. And then next we need to specify what we want to get, so the URL that we want to get. Because remember, this is the same thing that the browser is doing whenever it's using HTTP protocol, going out to a web page, getting some information. And then lastly, by default, sometimes you'll see that it's left out, but there is a last parameter here. So this is a Boolean parameter. And what this does is this checks if it's true, it's going to be asynchronous. And most of the time, that's what you want anyway. So now that we see that whenever we refresh, and if we go back to AJAX, we can see that our ready state actually has changed to 4. And we've actually got a response, we've got response text. So there's some more information here, and we're actually getting all of that information that's sitting on this page, and we're turning it back in the response text. So if we do something like, let me clear that. If I do AJAX and if I do response text, I'll show you what happens. We get all of that information from the page and return back as a text object. And we know from the earlier lessons that we can really easily convert this into usable JSON format. And that's really all there is to it. There are some parameters here and some conditions that we should check in order to make sure that things are functioning properly, but this is the basics that you need in order to create that AJAX request. And all of that, when we look at the jQuery libraries, this is all built on the same principles where we're making that request, we're setting the parameters for opening up that object, and then we're actually initiating the sending of the object. And that's actually what's changing the ready state. So let's add in some more parameters, because this is also really important. So this one is called on ready state change. And basically this fires off every time the ready state changes. And this is an important one because we ultimately only want to grab that response information once the ready state is 4 and once our status is 200. And they have a listing of them here on Wikipedia. So we know there's a whole bunch of different status codes, but the one that we're looking for is 200, success, okay. So this basically means that we've established the connection, everything is good, we've connected, we're on ready state 4, so we're able to get that information, so everything is ready to go. And we know that there's other errors that sometimes you'll see on the web. So there's the 404 error, so that's the page not found. So there's a number of different errors that can be returned. And we can see that whenever we're using the HTTP protocol, and this is using the same thing. So we are able to detect that the status values. So that's another really important one to keep in mind, that status values are really important. So when it comes to ready state, there's actually going to be 5 different states. So initially we start out at our unsent stage, and that's the one that we were sitting at before we added the send. So it was sitting at 0. The next one is that open has been added. So when we added in open, we moved to ready state 1. And then next is headers received, so the send. So header information has been sent. Number 3 is that we're started to download that response text that we just saw. And then last but not least, which is the most important one, we're looking for done. So we're looking for state 4, and we saw that whenever we list out this AJAX object, because we were able to make the connection, we were able to open, we were able to send, we ended up on ready state 4. And that's where we got the response text. Our status was 200. So everything was good. It was a successful request. So you need to keep all of these in mind, and this is why whenever we're writing it within this type of format, we check to see the value of the ready state. You can also console log out that state changed, and let's output those ready states as we're moving through them. So this one will fire off every time we move through a different ready state. So let's see what this looks like. So when we refresh it, so we know we start out at 0, so there isn't any change from 0. When it changes from 0 to 1, we get that the ready state is 1, our status is 0. When it states to 2, we've got a change, and we see that going back to here, that we've made a connection. So we've sent and we've connected. So that's why we're getting back 200. If we weren't connecting, so if I mess up this address here, and if I change it, we see that we get 1 and we get a status of 0. So we're not connecting. So that's why that one is important as well. So those are the 2 important ones to note, that we want to make sure that the ideal state is 4 for ready state and status is 200 before we try to return back or try to make use of that data. So that's why whenever we're doing these ready states, you most likely or commonly you should have that we have that ready state values. So we've got the one that we're looking for. We're looking for the ready state number. So we want to make sure that it's 4. And if it is 4, then we also want to check to see if the status, so we've got AJAX status. So the AJAX status is equal to 200. And if it is, then we know that, so we know at this point that we are ready for the data. And sometimes you can shorten this, that you might see it written like that, just to make sure that that shortens up that statement a little bit. So it's the same thing. We got to make sure, so it's we've got both of those conditions in place. So we know that once we get to this point, we're ready for our data. So we can just comment this part out. And now we're ready to make use of that information that we've returned. And remember earlier we saw, so whenever we type in our AJAX object, we've got all of our data here sitting in the response text. So let's grab that information. And instead of ready for data, we've already got our data. So we've got AJAX, and we can do response as well. So right now it's returning both. If you want it to make sure that it's as a text format, so we do the response text. So let's refresh that, and we see that we get all of that text back there as a usable object. So now what I want you to do is set this up here on your own and create a connection to a web API. So you can connect to any website. You can use randomuser.me/API as well. Or if you've got some other APIs that you want to connect to, feel free to make that connection now. You can also connect to websites and so on. There's a number of options here. So simply what this is doing is this is just returning back some data, some information that's contained on the web. So try it out for yourself. And next thing that I wanted to do is I want to make use of that data. So what we want to do is we want to pull this back and we want to parse that out. So let's set up our JSON data. And we know that from earlier lessons, we had JSON parse. And over here is where we can drop in our response text. And now let's console log out our JSON data. And this should be console log. So let me just save that. So let's refresh, and there we go. So we're ready to start using our information, just as we did earlier in the earlier exercise when we were looking at JSON and we were turning back that information. And we can also make use of it and put it on our web page. So I want you to try this all out for yourself and pull in that data and then output some of that information on your website. In the next lesson, we're going to dive deeper into what we're doing with this XHR object and some even more functionality that we can do with it. So that's coming up.